Have you ever wondered what it felt like to wake up in a world where death arrived without warning, where entire villages could empty in a season, where the rhythm of ordinary life continued even as the ground filled with graves? Picture a medieval morning, the air thick with wood smoke and the distant tolling of church bells, streets narrow enough to touch both walls at once, the smell of bread baking in stone ovens while somewhere, not far away, a cart creaks under its burden of wrapped bodies. Imagine a world where everyone you knew had lost someone, where physicians wore bird-beaked masks filled with herbs, where priests refused to enter homes marked with crosses, where children played in courtyards shadowed by the knowledge that tomorrow might not come. A world both heartbreakingly human and impossibly distant from our own. What did people eat when fields lay abandoned? How did they love when touch itself became dangerous? What jokes did they tell in taverns when half the benches sat empty? How did the mind adapt to a reality where survival felt more like accident than achievement? These aren't just questions about disease. They're questions about what it means to remain human when the world itself seems to be ending. About the strange, stubborn persistence of daily life, even in the darkest chapters of our history. If this story is helping you drift a little deeper into the quiet, you might consider subscribing to this channel. It's a small gesture, but it genuinely keeps these nighttime journeys going, and it gently reassures the algorithm that you enjoy wandering through forgotten worlds. And if you're still awake for a moment, tell me where you're listening from. I read those comments like tiny stars on a map, each one marking another sleepy traveller somewhere in the world. Take a slow breath in and let it fall away. Feel the quiet around you sharpen, the way medieval silence must have filled a world without machines, without certainty, without the comfort of knowing what tomorrow would bring. Make yourself comfortable wherever you are and let the edges of your day blur. Now let's drift backward, not millions of years this time, but across 7 centuries, to a moment when humanity faced something it could neither understand nor escape. So close your eyes and imagine the world as it was in the 1300s, when the Black Death arrived on merchant ships and changed everything. Let's step gently into a chapter of human history that medicine can now explain, but that still holds mysteries about how people survived, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, in all the small ways that mattered. You're standing on the docks of a Mediterranean port in the autumn of 1347. The air smells of salt and fish and the sharp tang of spices being unloaded from merchant galleys. You have no way of knowing that the world is about to change. The ships look ordinary, their sails patched and stained from the long journey, their crews tired but laughing as they secure the ropes. But in the hold, beneath bales of silk and sacks of pepper, something invisible has travelled with them, something patient, something that doesn't distinguish between the wealthy merchant and the dock worker who carries his cargo. By the time anyone notices the first fever, the first swelling, it will already be too late. The sailors don't look sick. They're weathered, yes, exhausted from weeks at sea, but that's normal. They move with the practiced efficiency of men who've made this journey dozens of times. They call out to each other in languages you half understand, Genoese Italian mixed with Greek, with Arabic, with the pigeon trade tongue of the Mediterranean. They've come from the east, from the trading posts on the Black Sea where European merchants meet Mongol caravans. They carry goods that have travelled thousands of miles, Chinese silk, Indian pepper, Persian carpets, the wealth of the world condensed into these wooden vessels. You watch as the dock workers begin unloading. Heavy sacks are hauled up from below, passed from hand to hand in a human chain. Barrels are rolled across the gangplank. A crate breaks open, and a cascade of cloves spills across the dock, their scent sharp and sweet in the salt air. Everyone laughs. Someone scoops them up quickly. Spices are worth more than gold. No one notices the rats. Or rather, everyone notices the rats. They're everywhere. Always, in any port city, but no one pays them particular attention. Rats are part of life, unwelcome but inevitable. They scurry down the mooring ropes, leap from ship to shore, disappear into the maze of warehouses and homes that line the waterfront. If you could see smaller, if your eyes could pierce the invisible world, you would see the real cargo. Tiny passengers riding on the rats, on the fleas that infest the rats. Bacteria called Yersinia pestis, named centuries later for the scientist who identified them, but utterly unknown to you. They've survived the journey from Central Asia, through the Silk Road trading posts, across the Black Sea, into these Mediterranean ports. They're remarkably hardy, these microorganisms. They can survive in dried blood, in grain stores, in the fabric of cloth. They wait in the bodies of fleas for their moment, patient as death itself. Within days, the first dock worker will feel unwell. A fever, he'll think. Perhaps he ate something bad. He'll go home early, stumble into his house, collapse onto his bed. His wife will place a cool cloth on his forehead, will make him broth. By the next morning, he'll have swellings in his neck, dark and painful. By the evening, he'll be delirious. 3 days later, he'll be dead. His wife will catch it from him. Then his children, then his neighbours, the priest who comes to give him last rites, the physician who examines him, the man who prepares his body for burial, and it will spread. Not like fire, which moves in a visible wave, but like water seeping through cracks in stone, finding every gap, every opening, filling every space. Within weeks, it will be everywhere. Within months, the Mediterranean ports will be devastated. Within a year, it will have reached England, Scandinavia, the furthest corners of Europe. But right now, in this moment, you're just watching ships arrive. The sun is warm on your face. Gulls cry overhead. Somewhere, someone is laughing. Let's start with what we do know. The disease appeared suddenly, almost impossibly fast. A man might wake feeling perfectly healthy, work a full day, and be dead before the church bells rang for vespers. The symptoms were unmistakable. Dark swellings in the neck, armpits and groin called buboes that gave the plague its name, high fever, delirium, and then, for most, death within 3 to 5 days. But here's what made it truly terrifying. No one knew why it happened. No pattern emerged. The pious died alongside the sinful, children alongside grandparents, the rich in their stone houses alongside the poor in their wooden hovels. Death seemed random, capricious, almost playful in its cruelty. The first deaths are noticed, but not particularly alarming. People die in medieval cities all the time. Disease is a constant companion. Dysentery, typhoid, smallpox, influenza. The average life expectancy hovers somewhere in the 30s, dragged down by devastating infant mortality. So when an elderly merchant dies of fever, his family mourns but doesn't panic. When a child succumbs to illness, it's heartbreaking but not unprecedented. Even when a cluster of deaths occurs in one neighbourhood, people assume it's just bad luck, perhaps something in the water from that particular well. But then the pattern accelerates. Within a week, there are 20 dead in one parish, then 50, then 100. The bodies come faster than they can be properly buried. Families who lose one member on Monday are burying 2 more by Friday. The physicians are baffled. They examine urine samples, they check pulses, they study the alignment of planets and consult their medical texts. But nothing matches what they're seeing. Some think it might be a particularly virulent form of anthrax. Others suspect pneumonia. None of their treatments work. Bloodletting doesn't help. Purging doesn't help. Prayers don't help. The buboes are particularly horrifying. They appear as swellings, usually in the lymph nodes, dark purple or black, sometimes as large as an apple. They're extraordinarily painful. The Greek physician writing about the plague in Byzantium describes patients crying out in agony, begging for death, unable to bear the pressure of the swellings. Some physicians try to lance them, believing that releasing the poison might save the patient. It doesn't. The fever that accompanies the buboes is intense, leading to hallucinations, to patients crying out about demons and angels, thrashing in their beds, not recognizing their own families. There are, it turns out, 3 forms of the plague. though no one in the 1400s knows this. The bubonic form, named for the buboes, is the most common. It has perhaps a 30 to 75% mortality rate. Terrible, but not absolute. The pneumonic form, which attacks the lungs, spreads through coughing and has a nearly 100% mortality rate. The septicemic form, where the bacteria flood the bloodstream, kills before buboes even have time to form. Victims of the septicemic form sometimes die so quickly that they're found dead in the streets, having collapsed mid-step, their faces frozen in expressions of surprise. What you notice, living through these first weeks, is how quickly normal life disintegrates. The usual patterns, work, market, church, home, become disrupted. People stop showing up for their jobs, shops close without explanation. You pass a house where you heard crying yesterday, and today find the door hanging open, everyone inside dead or fled. The smell begins to permeate everything. It's not just the smell of death, though, that's certainly part of it. It's the smell of a city that's stopped functioning properly. Waste accumulating in the streets, bodies awaiting burial, homes where the sick lie unattended because everyone who might have cared for them is dead or too frightened to enter. And underneath all of it is the question that no one can answer. Why? Why is this happening? What have we done to deserve this? Is it punishment? Is it random? Is it the end of the world, the apocalypse prophesied in Scripture? The inability to understand, to find meaning or pattern, is almost as devastating as the disease itself. Think about that for a moment. Imagine trying to comprehend loss on a scale your mind simply wasn't built to process. In some cities, half the population died within a year, in others, even more. Entire families were wiped out in a week. Streets that had echoed with voices fell silent. The numbers are almost impossible to grasp. Somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population vanished in just 5 years. That's roughly 75 to 200 million people. But numbers don't capture what it felt like to live through, to watch the world empty around you, one funeral at a time. Let's try to make this more concrete. Imagine you live in a city of 10,000 people. It's not a huge city by medieval standards, but it's substantial, large enough to have multiple churches, a market square, guild halls, a wall with gates, perhaps 200 people by name. Your immediate family, your extended family, your neighbours, your co-workers, the merchants you buy from, the priest at your church, the beggars you pass every day. These people form the fabric of your daily life. Each one is a complete person with their own stories, their own hopes, their own networks of relationships. Now imagine that within 12 months, half of them are gone. 100 of those 200 people you know personally have died. Your sister, your best friend, the baker, the blacksmith, the woman who sold you vegetables every Thursday, the children who played in the street outside your house. Gone. And it's not just your experience. Everyone around you is going through the same thing. The grief is not individual, it's collective, universal, suffocating. There's no escape from it because every conversation, every interaction is shadowed by loss. The chroniclers of the time try to record what's happening, but their accounts become increasingly desperate. Giovanni Boccaccio, writing in Florence, describes streets empty except for the dead and dying, houses abandoned, their doors hanging open like mouths frozen mid-scream. He writes of the birds falling from the sky after pecking at infected corpses, of animals refusing to touch the bodies of plague victims. Some of this is exaggeration, the kind of hyperbole that grief and trauma produce, but some of it is simply accurate observation of an unfolding catastrophe. The numbers vary by region. In rural areas, where population density is lower, the death toll is sometimes less severe, though whole villages still vanish, their fields returning to wilderness, their churches empty and silent. In cities, packed tight with people living in close quarters, sharing wells, shopping in crowded markets, the mortality can reach 60, 70, even 80%. The city of Siena loses perhaps 2/3 of its population. The chronicler Agnolo di Tura writes of burying his 5 children with his own hands. He describes the city as being so depopulated that grass grows in the main square. What happens to a society when that many people die? The immediate answer is chaos. Nothing works anymore. The bakeries can't function because there aren't enough bakers and millers and farmers. The mills stop turning because there's no one to operate them. The market's empty because there aren't enough merchants and customers. The churches struggle because priests are dying at catastrophic rates. They're in contact with the sick more than almost anyone else, administering last rites, hearing confessions, and they pay for their devotion with their lives. The legal system collapses. There aren't enough judges, enough clerks, enough lawyers. Inheritance becomes almost meaninglessly complex when entire family lines are wiped out. Who inherits when the father, all his sons, his brothers and his nephews are all dead? Property disputes that would normally take months to resolve through courts are instead settled by whoever has the strength or the audacity to simply occupy the property. Some people become wealthy overnight by default, the last surviving members of wealthy families. Others lose everything when distant relatives they've never met claim ancestral rights. But perhaps the most devastating aspect is simply the loneliness. Humans are social creatures. We define ourselves through our relationships, our communities, our families, and suddenly all of that is stripped away. You might be the only survivor of your family, the only one left in your neighbourhood. You walk through streets where you once knew everyone and now recognise almost no one. The faces are new, strangers who've moved into abandoned houses, or they're familiar but hollowed out by grief, transformed by loss into something unfamiliar. The world becomes populated by ghosts, by absences, by the constant reminder of what was and will never be again. So what did an ordinary morning look like in this extraordinary time? You wake before dawn in a house that feels too quiet. Perhaps you've lost a brother, a daughter, your wife. The absence hangs in the air like smoke, but you still rise. You still wash your face in cold water from a wooden basin. You still say your prayers, though they feel more desperate now, less certain. The bread you eat might be harder than usual, coarser, because the baker's apprentice died last week and no one has replaced him yet. The world has not stopped, but it has slowed, become heavier, like wading through deep water. The first thing you become aware of, emerging from sleep, is whether you feel any pain, any swelling, any fever. This is the new morning ritual, the careful internal inventory of your body. You move your fingers, your toes. You swallow and pay attention to whether your throat hurts. You touch your neck, your armpits, your groin, feeling for any suspicious lumps. If you find nothing, there's a moment of profound relief. You've survived another night. You have at least another day. This will be your ritual every morning for years, long after the worst of the plague has passed. The fear becomes part of you, woven into the fabric of daily life. You dress in the dim light. If you're fortunate enough to have a window, you might notice whether smoke is rising from your neighbour's chimneys. Smoke means someone is alive, someone is cooking, maintaining the rhythms of ordinary life. No smoke might mean the house is empty, its occupants dead or fled. You've learned not to investigate too closely. It's safer, both physically and emotionally, to maintain a certain distance. You pull on your tunic, your hose, your shoes, leather, worn, but still serviceable. Clothing has become valuable in a strange way. With so many dead, there's actually a surplus of garments, but fewer people with the skill to make new ones or repair old ones. The water in your basin is cold. In better times, someone might have warmed it over the fire, but if you live alone now, these small comforts have vanished. You splash it on your face, feeling the shock of cold bring you fully awake. You use a cloth to wash as much of yourself as practical. Full baths are rare, time-consuming, and considered somewhat dangerous by medieval medical theory, which believes that water opens the pores and allows disease to enter the body. Given what's happening, you're not inclined to take any chances. Prayer comes next, though your relationship with God has become complicated. You kneel beside your bed or before a small shrine if you have one. perhaps a wooden cross, a cheap printed image of the Virgin Mary. The prayers you learned as a child come automatically, but the words feel different now. You're asking for protection, for survival, for the plague to pass. You're asking why, though you know no answer will come. You're bargaining, making promises about how you'll live if you're spared. You're confessing sins just in case today is your last day and you haven't had time to reach a priest. The prayers are both comfort and accusation, a conversation with a God who seems to have turned his face away from the world. Then comes breakfast, if you can call it that. Bread, certainly, though the quality depends on what grain is available and who's still alive to mill it and bake it. The baker's shop might be open, or it might not. Bread might be fresh, or it might be several days old, hardened to the point where you need to dip it in water or weak ale to soften it enough to chew. If you're fortunate, you might have cheese or a bit of salted fish. If you're poor, it's just bread and whatever vegetables you can afford or grow yourself. The act of eating has become strangely mechanical, joyless. Food is fuel, nothing more. The pleasure of shared meals, of family gathered around a table, has been taken by the plague along with so many other small joys. As you eat, you plan your day. What needs to be done? If you're a craftsman, you have work, though your workshop might be emptier than it once was. Apprentices dead, journeymen fled. If you're a labourer, work is actually easier to find now. There aren't enough hands for all the tasks that need doing. If you're a merchant, you're navigating a landscape where supply chains have collapsed and demand is unpredictable. And if you're a peasant, you're looking at fields that need tending with far too few people to tend them. You finish your bread. You stand. You move toward the door of your house, preparing to step outside into a world that looks familiar but feels alien. The sun is rising, indifferent to human suffering. The birds are singing, because birds don't know or care about plague. And you're about to join the others who've survived, who've woken up and decided to continue, to maintain the routines that define humanity, even when humanity itself seems to be ending. The sound that defines this era is not the cheerful ringing of festival bells, but the slow, sombre tolling of funeral bells. And by the second year of the plague, they ring almost constantly. Some cities eventually ban them, not out of disrespect, but because the endless reminder of death is driving people mad. The silence that follows is somehow worse. In your mind, you can still hear them, morning, afternoon, evening, through the night, counting the dead like a shepherd counts sheep, a rhythm that marks the passing of a world that will never return. Church bells have always been the voice of medieval cities. They tell time in a world without clocks. They mark the hours of prayer, matins before dawn, prime at sunrise, terce at mid-morning, sext at noon, none in the afternoon, vespers at sunset, compline before bed. They announce celebrations, festivals, weddings. They warn of danger, fire, invasion, emergency. Every bell has its own voice, its own tone, and long-time residents can distinguish between them without seeing which church tower they're coming from. The bells are how you know where you are in the day, in the year, in the rhythm of life. But now the bells speak almost entirely of death. The funeral toll is different from other bells, slower, more deliberate, usually a pattern of 9 strikes for a man, 6 for a woman, 3 for a child, repeated at intervals. It's meant to be solemn, respectful, a way of marking the passing of a soul and calling the community to prayer. In normal times, you might hear it once or twice a day. In plague times, you hear it constantly. Sometimes multiple churches are tolling simultaneously, their sounds overlapping, creating a dissonant symphony of grief that hangs over the city like fog. You try not to count them, but you can't help it. Your mind automatically tallies. 3 this morning already, and it's not yet terce. That makes how many this week? You've lost count. Sometimes you try to figure out who they're for. That toll from St. Mary's Church, could that be for the cobbler on Bridge Street? You heard he was sick, or the widow who lived near the South Gate. But there are so many dead that it's impossible to keep track. The names blur together. The faces fade. Death has become so common that it's almost lost its meaning, almost become background noise. and then some cities make the decision to stop. The authorities, what's left of them, decree that the bell should no longer ring for plague victims. The official reason is usually practical. The bell ringers themselves are dying, and there aren't enough of them to keep up with demand. But the real reason is psychological. The constant tolling is breaking people's spirits. Physicians report that the sound of the bells is making people sick with fear, that the stress is weakening bodies and making them more susceptible to disease. Whether this is medically accurate by modern standards is irrelevant. People believe it, and belief has power. The silence that follows the ban is profound and disturbing. You wake one morning and realise you haven't heard bells since yesterday. At first there's relief. The oppressive weight of that constant reminder has lifted. You can almost pretend for a moment that things are normal, but then the opposite reaction sets in. Without the bells, you have no way of knowing how many are dying. The death becomes invisible, hidden behind closed doors. You pass houses and have no idea if everyone inside is alive or dead. The not knowing becomes its own form of torture. At least with the bells, there was information, a kind of communal acknowledgement of what was happening. Some people start counting in other ways. They watch for funeral processions, for the carts that carry bodies to mass graves. They listen for the crying that emanates from houses where someone has just died. They watch for doors marked with crosses or other symbols indicating plague within. The human need to measure, to quantify, to understand the scope of the disaster doesn't go away just because the bells have stopped. We need to know, even when knowing brings no comfort. At night, lying in bed, you sometimes imagine you can still hear them. Phantom bells tolling in your mind. The rhythm of them has become so ingrained that your brain supplies the sound even in silence. Or perhaps you're hearing real bells from distant churches outside the city limits, where the ban doesn't apply. Or perhaps it's just the memory of bells, the echo of all those mornings and afternoons and evenings when they rang and rang and rang, marking the passage not of time but of souls, not of hours but of lives, until the distinction between the living and the dead became almost meaningless, until the whole world seemed to be one vast funeral, one endless requiem, one long goodbye. When you fall ill, you call for a doctor, though you know deep down it may be useless. The physician arrives wearing a strange, unsettling costume, a long waxed robe, gloves, and that infamous bird-like mask with a long beak stuffed with aromatic herbs and flowers. The theory, such as it is, suggests that bad air, miasma, carries the disease, and the fragrant stuffing protects the wearer. It doesn't. But the sight of that masked figure has become the symbol of the plague itself, death walking upright in the shape of a raven. He examines you carefully, takes your pulse, studies your urine in a glass flask. He prescribes bloodletting, or perhaps a poultice of herbs. You know others who tried these remedies. None of them survived. The physician's costume is designed according to the best medical theory of the age. The long coat, often made of leather or waxed canvas, is meant to keep bad air away from the skin. The gloves protect the hands from direct contact with infected patients. The mask, that distinctive beaked mask, is filled with aromatic herbs, sometimes mixed with camphor or vinegar-soaked sponges. The belief is that strong, pleasant smells combat the bad smells, the miasma that carries disease. Roses, lavender, mint, cloves, myrrh, anything fragrant is stuffed into that beak. The physician breathes through this filter, believing it protects him. Sometimes it does, but not for the reasons he thinks. The costume creates a barrier, a physical separation between doctor and patient. It's not the aromatics that help, it's the simple fact that he's not in direct contact with bodily fluids, not breathing air directly from the patient's lungs. When the plague is pneumonic, spread through coughing, this distance might actually save him. But when it's bubonic, spread by fleas, the costume is useless. The fleas jump onto the leather coat and hide in its folds. The physician carries them from house to house, becoming an inadvertent vector of the very disease he's trying to combat. The examination itself follows established medical protocol. The physician checks your pulse, feeling its strength and rhythm. He examines your tongue, looking at its colour and coating. He asks you to urinate into a glass flask so he can study the urine's colour, clarity and smell. Uroscopy is a major diagnostic tool in medieval medicine. He might smell your breath, looking for particular odours that indicate imbalance in the body's humours. When he finds the buboes, he examines them carefully but doesn't touch them directly. He notes their location, their colour, their size. The diagnosis is inevitable. Plague. The treatment options are limited and largely ineffective. Bloodletting is almost always prescribed, based on the theory that the body's humours have become imbalanced and need to be drained to restore equilibrium. The physician might open a vein in your arm and let you bleed into a bowl, or he might apply leeches. You're already weakened by fever and infection. The blood loss makes everything worse. Some patients die from the bloodletting before the plague can finish them. Poultices are another common treatment. The physician might prepare a mixture of herbs, perhaps onions, garlic, crushed emeralds if you can afford them, and apply it directly to the buboes. The theory is that the poultice will draw out the poison. It doesn't work, but it probably doesn't make things worse either, which is more than can be said for some treatments. Some physicians recommend burning aromatic woods in the patient's room, filling the air with smoke to drive out the bad air. Others suggest drinking solutions of crushed pearls or gold dust. The wealthy spend fortunes on these remedies. The poor make do with herbs and prayers. A few physicians, the ones who observe carefully and think independently, begin to notice patterns. They see that the disease seems to spread through contact, that those who care for the sick often become sick themselves. They recommend isolation, keeping the sick separate from the healthy. This advice is largely ignored, both because it's contrary to Christian charity, which demands that you care for the suffering, and because it's practically difficult. Where do you isolate someone in a crowded medieval house? How do you abandon a sick family member? But the physicians who follow their own advice, who maintain distance from their patients, tend to survive at higher rates than their colleagues who don't. Most physicians, though, die. They're in constant contact with the sick. They move from house to house, from patient to patient, breathing infected air, touching contaminated surfaces. Their dedication is admirable, but it costs them their lives. In some cities, the mortality rate among physicians approaches 100%. The ones who survive are often the ones who fled early, who abandoned their posts and their patients to save themselves. This creates a terrible moral dilemma that will haunt medical ethics for centuries. When does self-preservation become cowardice? When does staying and helping become pointless suicide? You watch the masked figure leave your house. He's told you what you already knew. You have the plague. He's given you treatments that you suspect won't work. He's charged you a fee that seems exorbitant given the uselessness of his intervention. But you're oddly grateful nonetheless. The ritual of it matters. The fact that someone came, someone examined you, someone tried to help, even if that help is futile. In a world falling apart, these small gestures of continued civilization, of maintained professional relationships, of people still performing their roles, these things matter more than you can articulate. Because the truth is, no one knows what causes this. The theories multiply as quickly as the dead. Some say it's a punishment from God for humanity's sins. Others blame the Jews, leading to horrific pogroms across Europe as desperate people seek anyone to blame. Some think it's caused by an unfortunate alignment of the planets, Saturn, Jupiter and Mars converging in a way that corrupts the air. Others believe it comes from earthquakes releasing poisonous vapours from the earth. A few physicians, working carefully, begin to notice that it seems to spread through contact, that those who touch the sick often sicken themselves. But this observation is drowned out by louder, more confident voices offering celestial explanations. The randomness is what terrifies people most. If you could understand it, perhaps you could stop it. The divine punishment theory is perhaps the most widespread. It makes a certain kind of sense in a deeply religious age. Nothing happens without God's will. Therefore this catastrophe must be God's will. Therefore it must have a purpose, a meaning. The plague is punishment for sin, for pride, for greed, for lust, for all the ways humanity has strayed from righteous living. The clergy preach this message from their pulpits, though with decreasing conviction as they watch the pious die alongside the sinful. The priests themselves die alongside their congregations. If this is punishment, it's indiscriminate punishment, which raises uncomfortable theological questions about divine justice. But the explanation provides comfort of a kind. If the plague is punishment, then it can be appeased. You can repent. You can confess your sins. You can make donations to the church, perform acts of charity, flagellate yourself, pray harder. You have agency, some measure of control. This is preferable to the alternative, that the plague is random, meaningless, a biological accident that kills without regard for virtue or vice. That possibility is too terrifying to contemplate. The astronomical explanation has the backing of medical authority. The medical faculty at the University of Paris issues a formal opinion in 1348, attributing the plague to a triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius that occurred on March 20th, 1345. This conjunction, they explain, corrupted the air, creating a miasma that spreads disease. This theory has the advantage of being both scientific sounding and unfalsifiable. The conjunction happened, the plague happened, therefore the conjunction caused the plague. The fact that the conjunction occurred 3 years before the plague began is explained away through complex astrological reasoning about delayed effects. The earthquake theory emerges from observations that many regions experienced seismic activity in the years before the plague. The explanation is that these earthquakes opened fissures in the earth, releasing poisonous vapours, sulphurous gases from hell itself, some claim, that corrupted the air and caused disease. This theory has the advantage of being partially observable. Earthquakes did happen. Bad smells do sometimes emerge from the earth. The connection to disease seems logical. Some versions of this theory blend it with divine punishment. God sent the earthquakes as the mechanism of punishment. Then there's the Jewish conspiracy theory, which is not a theory so much as an excuse for violence. The accusation is that Jews poisoned the wells, deliberately spreading plague as part of a plot to destroy Christianity. This makes no sense on any level. Jews are dying from plague at the same rate as Christians. They drink from the same wells. They have no means or motive for such an act. But logic is irrelevant when people are terrified and desperate for someone to blame. The pogroms begin in the spring of 1348 and spread across Europe. Entire Jewish communities are massacred. Survivors flee eastward, creating the concentration of Jewish population in Eastern Europe that will persist for centuries. Pope Clement VI issues 2 papal bulls in 1348 and 1349 condemning the persecution of Jews. He points out that Jews are dying from the plague, that it spreads in regions with no Jewish population, that blaming them is irrational and unchristian. His intervention saves some lives but doesn't stop the pogroms. Fear overrides reason. The need to blame overrides evidence. A few observers, though, are noticing something important. They see that people who care for the sick often get sick themselves. They notice that cities can sometimes slow the spread by isolating the sick. The Italian physician Gentile da Foligno, before dying of plague himself, writes that the disease seems to spread through infected air breathed out by the sick. He's not entirely right, he still believes in miasma, but he's noticed the pattern of transmission. The French physician Guy de Chauliac notices that the disease spreads through contact and recommends that physicians minimise their time with patients and maintain distance when possible. But these voices of empirical observation are marginal. They're drowned out by the louder, more confident voices that offer comprehensive explanations grounded in established authority, religious, astrological, philosophical. The truth is, in 1348, no one has the tools to understand what's really happening. Bacteria haven't been discovered. Germ theory won't exist for another 500 years. The best anyone can do is observe patterns and try to make sense of them through the conceptual frameworks available. And those frameworks, divine will, astrological influence, humoral imbalance, simply aren't adequate to explain a bacterial pandemic. So people believe what makes sense to them. what offers comfort or explanation or someone to blame, and they act on those beliefs, sometimes with heroic selflessness, sometimes with horrifying cruelty, stumbling through the darkness of their ignorance toward a dawn of understanding that won't arrive for centuries. And then, almost suddenly, something strange begins to happen. Groups of people appear on the roads, travelling from town to town in long processions. They wear simple robes and carry whips, leather straps embedded with sharp fragments of metal. They stop in village squares and public spaces, strip to the waist, and begin to beat themselves, drawing blood, crying out prayers and songs. They believe that by taking on physical suffering, by punishing their own flesh, they can convince God to lift the plague. The crowds that gather to watch them are both horrified and mesmerized. Some join, others turn away. The church eventually condemns the practice, but for a while, these flagellants become a defining image of the era, pain offered up as prayer. Blood as bargaining. The first flagellant bands appear in Germanic lands in early 1348 and spread quickly across Europe. They're organised, following rules and rituals that have been carefully worked out. A typical group numbers between 50 and 500 people, led by a master who directs their movements and devotions. They travel from town to town, never staying more than a few days in one place. They accept no money, rely on charity for food and shelter, and maintain strict discipline within their ranks. Their public performances follow a set pattern. They enter a town in procession, singing hymns in the vernacular rather than Latin, making their movement accessible to common people. They proceed to their main church or the market square, forming a circle. At the master's signal, they remove their outer garments, standing bare to the waist regardless of weather. Then they lie down in specific postures. Those guilty of murder lie on their stomachs. Adulterers lie on their sides. Perjurers hold up 3 fingers. The symbolism is clear. They're enacting their sins, making them visible, punishable. Then comes the flagellation. They stand and begin to beat themselves with their whips, knotted leather cords embedded with metal studs or sharpened points. The sound of leather striking flesh creates a rhythm, accompanied by their chanted prayers and songs. They cry out to God for mercy, to the Virgin Mary for intercession, begging that the plague be lifted. Blood flows from their backs and shoulders, spattering the ground. The performance typically lasts perhaps 20 to 30 minutes, after which they collapse, exhausted and bleeding. The crowd, which has been watching in horrified fascination, often bursts into weeping and wailing. The theology behind the practice is complex but coherent within medieval Christian thought. Christ suffered on the cross for humanity's sins. By inflicting suffering on themselves, the flagellants are imitating Christ, participating in his sacrifice, offering their pain as penance for the collective sins that have brought God's punishment upon the world. It's not suicide. Suicide is a sin, but it's a kind of controlled, ritualized self-harm that borders on it. Some flagellants die from their wounds, from infections, from sheer exhaustion. They're considered martyrs, holy victims whose sacrifice might help save others. The movement spreads with remarkable speed, particularly in regions being devastated by plague. For people who feel utterly helpless, who've watched their families die and their communities collapse, the flagellants offer something desperately needed: action, a way to do something, anything, to fight back against the catastrophe. Joining a flagellant band means surrendering your normal life, but for many that life has already been destroyed. At least this gives your suffering meaning, transforms your pain from random cruelty into purposeful sacrifice. The crowds that gather to watch are experiencing something complex. There's religious devotion. Certainly, many people genuinely believe this might help. There's also spectacle. In a time before entertainment as we know it, a flagellant performance is riveting theatre. There's the catharsis of shared grief, of communal acknowledgement that things are terrible and something must be done. And there's also, perhaps, a hint of the carnival, the same dark fascination that draws crowds to executions and other public displays of pain. But the church becomes alarmed. The flagellants are operating outside official control, performing religious rituals without clerical oversight. They're hearing each other's confessions, absolving each other's sins, prerogatives that should belong only to ordained priests. Some flagellant preachers are saying that their sacrifice is more powerful than the sacraments, that they have a direct relationship with God that doesn't require church mediation. This is dangerous talk, bordering on heresy. In October 1349, Pope Clement VI issues a bull condemning the flagellant movement and ordering bishops to suppress it. The suppression is gradual and incomplete. Some flagellant bands dissolve voluntarily. Others are forcibly disbanded by church and civil authorities. A few go underground, continuing their practices in secret. The movement leaves a legacy, though. The hymns the flagellants sang in German and other vernacular languages rather than Latin contribute to a tradition of popular religious music. The idea that lay people can have direct, powerful relationships with God without needing clerical intermediaries, this idea, though condemned, doesn't die. It will resurface in various reform movements and ultimately contribute to the Protestant Reformation 2 centuries later. You watch a flagellant procession pass through your town. Part of you is moved, tears streaming down your face as you watch these people hurt themselves for your sins, for everyone's sins. Part of you is disturbed, wondering if God really wants this, if this is holiness or madness. And part of you, a small, secret part, is simply grateful that you're watching rather than participating, that your back remains unwhipped, your blood remains inside your body, your suffering remains private rather than public spectacle. Step outside the city for a moment. Let your eyes adjust to the wider landscape. The fields that should be golden with wheat lie brown and overgrown. There simply aren't enough workers to bring in the harvest. Entire villages have been abandoned, the doors hanging open, their gardens returning to wilderness. Cattle wander loose, unmilked, bellowing in distress. Sheep cluster in untended flocks, their wool heavy and matted. The social order that kept medieval agriculture functioning, the careful hierarchy of lord and peasant, the seasonal rhythms of planting and harvest, has collapsed. Those who survived the plague now face a different threat: starvation. Medieval agriculture is labour-intensive, requiring enormous amounts of human work at specific times. Ploughing in early spring, planting, weeding through summer, harvesting in late summer and fall, threshing, storing. Every stage requires hands, many hands, all working in coordination. A typical manor might have 50 to 100 peasant families working the land. When half of them die within a year, the system breaks down completely. The spring of 1349 is particularly catastrophic. In many regions, the plague has peaked over the winter, killing a substantial portion of the rural population. Now it's time to plough and plant, but there aren't enough people to do the work. Fields that have been cultivated for centuries lie fallow, reverting to scrubland. The few surviving peasants are overwhelmed, unable to work their own strips of land plus all the abandoned holdings around them. Some try. They work from dawn to dusk, desperately attempting to plant enough to ensure food for the coming year. Many fail. The exhaustion, the stress, makes them more vulnerable to disease. They survive the plague only to die from overwork and despair. The lords, the nobles who own the land, are often dead themselves, or dealing with catastrophic losses. A lord whose manor generated enough income to support his family and maintain his position in society now finds that income has vanished. The peasants who owed him labour service are dead. The fields that produce grain for sale lie empty. His financial situation goes from comfortable to desperate almost overnight. Some lords try to enforce the old obligations, demanding that surviving peasants work not just their own land but also the abandoned holdings. This is deeply unpopular and largely unenforceable. The peasants who survived have options now. They can leave and find lords willing to offer better terms. The autumn harvest, or lack of it, creates immediate crisis. The grain that should be stored to feed people through winter and provide seed for next year's planting is simply not there. Grain prices spike. Bread, the foundation of the medieval diet, becomes scarce and expensive. The poor, who already lived on the edge of subsistence, fall over that edge into starvation. Some turn to eating things they wouldn't normally consider food: grass, tree bark, roots. The mortality doesn't stop when the plague recedes. It continues through hunger and the diseases that accompany malnutrition. The animals suffer too in ways that are heartbreaking to witness. Dairy cows, bred to produce far more milk than their calves need, require regular milking, or they suffer painful inflammation and infection. With their owners dead, many cattle go unmilked, bellowing in agony, their udders swollen and leaking. Some eventually dry up naturally, others die from infection. Sheep need regular shearing, or their wool becomes so heavy and matted that they can barely move. By the summer of 1350, you can find sheep collapsed in fields, unable to stand under the weight of 2 years' worth of wool, flies buzzing around them, slowly dying of heat and thirst and neglect. Some villages are completely abandoned. You might pass through one on your travels and find it eerily intact but lifeless. The houses still stand, though doors bang in the wind. Gardens have become overgrown tangles. The church is empty, its altar dusty, its benches unused. Sometimes there are signs of hurried departure, a meal left on a table, now mouldy and swarming with insects. A child's toy abandoned in the street. More often there are signs of death. Graves, some marked, some not. Bodies, if the plague killed everyone too quickly for burial. These ghost villages are profoundly disturbing. They're evidence of a world that simply stopped, lives interrupted mid-sentence and never resumed. Wildlife begins to reclaim the abandoned land. Forests encroach on fields. Deer, no longer hunted as intensively, grow bolder, venturing into cultivated areas. Wolves, in regions where they still exist, find easy prey in the unmilked cattle and unsheared sheep. The boundary between civilization and wilderness, carefully maintained for centuries, begins to blur. Land that was cleared and farmed by Romans, by their medieval successors, for over 1,000 years starts to revert. Some of it will never be reclaimed. Even today you can find traces of these abandoned medieval villages, slight ridges in fields that mark where buildings once stood, irregularities in hedgelines that follow boundaries drawn in the 1300s and then forgotten. You stand at the edge of a field you've known your whole life. As a child, you helped with the harvest here, cleaning leftover grain behind the reapers. You can remember it full of people, full of life, everyone working together to bring in the crop before the weather turned. Now it's silent except for the wind moving through the unharvested grain, which has grown wild and tangled, half flattened by storms. No one is coming to harvest it. There's no one left. The wheat will rot where it stands, wasted, while people in the cities go hungry. The wrongness of it, the sheer waste, is almost worse than the death itself. But here's where things get strange again. In that way, history sometimes does. For the peasants and workers who survive, the world transforms in unexpected ways. Suddenly labour is valuable. There aren't enough hands to do the work, and those who remain can demand wages that would have been unthinkable before. Lords who once commanded absolute obedience now must negotiate, must offer better conditions, higher pay. It's not a revolution, not yet, but it's the beginning of a shift in power that will reshape European society for centuries. The survivors inherit a world where they, for perhaps the first time, have leverage. The Black Death, for all its horror, begins to erode the rigid structures of feudalism. The economic transformation is neither immediate nor uniform, but it's profound. Before the plague, labour is cheap and plentiful. A lord has more peasants than he needs. If one is dissatisfied with his conditions and tries to leave, there are 10 others waiting to take his place. The peasant has essentially no bargaining power. He works the land assigned to him, provides labour services to his lord, and accepts whatever terms are offered. It's not quite slavery. He has some legal rights. He can't be bought and sold, but it's not freedom either. After the plague, the calculation changes completely. Now the Lord has far more land than he has workers to farm it. He desperately needs labour to bring in what crops can still be planted and harvested. The surviving peasants know this. They know they're suddenly valuable. So they start to bargain. They say they'll work, but only for wages, not just for traditional obligations. They say they'll work, but only if conditions improve. And most radical of all, they start to leave. They walk away from the manors where they and their families have lived for generations, seeking lords who will offer better terms. This mobility is technically illegal. The feudal system is built on the assumption that peasants are tied to the land, that they work the same fields their ancestors worked. But with so many dead, with records lost or confused, with no one quite sure anymore who owns what or who owes what to whom, enforcement becomes nearly impossible. A peasant can show up at a new manor, claim his previous lord died in the plague, and negotiate a fresh start. Even if this is a lie, the new lord probably won't investigate too carefully. He needs workers more than he needs to enforce abstractions about social order. Wages for agricultural labour roughly double between 1350 and 1370. In some regions, they triple. A day labourer who earned 2 pence a day before the plague might now earn 4 or 6. This doesn't make him wealthy. Prices for goods are also rising, but it gives him breathing room, choices, a bit of control over his own life. He can save money. He can afford better food, better clothing. If he's treated badly, he can leave and find another employer. For the first time in his life, possibly for the first time in his family's history going back centuries, he has options. The nobles are horrified. They see the whole social order unravelling. Peasants are supposed to know their place, to accept their station in life as ordained by God. This new assertiveness, this mobility, this wage negotiation, it's not just economically threatening, it's theologically disturbing. If peasants can bargain with lords as equals, what does that say about the God-given hierarchy of society? The response is predictable. They try to legislate the problem away. England passes the Statute of Labourers in 1351, fixing wages at pre-plague levels and forbidding workers from leaving their home parishes. France passes similar ordinances, so do various German principalities and Italian city-states. These laws are almost entirely ineffective. They're impossible to enforce when labour is so desperately needed. A lord might support wage controls in principle, but when his own fields need harvesting and the only available workers demand high wages, principle gives way to practical necessity. He pays what he must and hopes his neighbours do the same. The laws create resentment, though. Workers who feel they should earn more but are forbidden from demanding it, who see themselves cheated by legal manipulation, become angry. This anger will eventually erupt into violence. The peasants' revolt in England in 1381, similar uprisings in France and elsewhere. But there's another economic shift happening simultaneously. Less visible, but equally important, with so much property changing hands through death and inheritance, with so many established businesses collapsing and new ones emerging, with prices and wages in flux, there's enormous opportunity for those clever or ruthless enough to seize it. Some merchants become wealthy buying goods from desperate sellers at low prices and selling them at high prices in markets where they're scarce. Some craftsmen expand into abandoned workshops, taking on apprentices at favourable terms because young men have fewer options. Some peasants accumulate multiple landholdings, becoming in effect small farmers rather than subsistence peasants. The distribution of wealth becomes somewhat less unequal, not because the rich become poor, but because some of the poor become middling. The rigid 3-tier structure of medieval society, those who pray, those who fight, those who work, starts to show cracks. A new category emerges, those who buy and sell, who accumulate capital, who operate in a market economy rather than a feudal one. These people, merchants, skilled craftsmen, prosperous farmers, will eventually form the basis of a middle class, though that term doesn't exist yet. The seeds of capitalism, of a market-based economy, of a world where money and skill matter more than birth and title, are being planted in the plague-churned soil of the 1350s. You experienced this transformation personally. Before the plague, you were a landless labourer, working whatever jobs you could find, never quite earning enough, always one bad harvest away from starvation. Now you have steady work. There's more work than can possibly be done, and you're earning enough to save a little. You've been able to buy better tools, better clothes. You're eating meat twice a week, something you once did only on major feast days. You've even thought about renting a small plot of land for yourself, growing your own crops. It's not wealth, but it's security, possibility, a future that contains something more than just survival. The plague took everything from you, your wife, your 2 children, your parents, but it also paradoxically gave you something, a chance, however small, to build a different life. You walk through the market square on a morning that would have once been crowded, boisterous, alive with haggling voices and the smell of fresh bread and roasting meat. Now half the stalls stand empty. The baker is there, but his prices have doubled. The butcher is absent. He died 3 weeks ago, and his widow has closed the shop. A woman sells vegetables from a cart, her face hollow with grief, but her voice steady as she calls out her wares. Business continues because it must. People need to eat. They need cloth and candles and tools. The market becomes a place of quiet resilience, a testament to the stubborn human insistence on living, even in the shadow of death. The market square itself looks different now. The wooden stalls that once formed tight rows, forcing customers to squeeze through narrow passages between them, are spaced farther apart. There's room to move, room to breathe. This should feel pleasant, spacious, but instead it feels wrong, like teeth missing from a mouth. The empty spaces are absences, each one representing a merchant who died or fled or simply gave up. Some stalls have been taken over by new vendors, younger people, often, stepping into roles they never expected to fill. A 16-year-old boy now runs his dead father's cobbler stall, his stitching less skilled, but improving. A widow who once only helped her husband now operates their candle-making business alone, her hands shaking slightly as she makes change. The goods available have changed too. Luxury items are scarce. The long-distance trade networks that brought spices and silks and fine wines have been disrupted. The merchants who travelled those routes are dead, or the cities they traded with are devastated, or the roads between have become too dangerous with bandits and chaos. What you find instead are necessities. Bread, though expensive. Root vegetables, dried fish, coarse cloth, basic tools. The market has contracted to serving survival needs rather than desires. The woman selling vegetables has less variety than she once did. Her husband is dead, her sons are dead, and she can't work the large garden plots they once maintained. She grows what she can manage alone. Onions, turnips, cabbage. Simple things that store well. The prices shock you every time, even though you've begun to earn more. A loaf of bread that cost a penny now costs 3. The baker explains, his voice weary, that grain is scarce, that fewer fields were planted and harvested, that he's had to pay more for flour than ever before. You know he's not lying. You've seen the abandoned fields yourself. But the knowledge doesn't make the bread more affordable. You buy less than you want, counting your coins carefully. Around you, others are doing the same, calculating, compromising, deciding what they can do without. There's a strange economy of inheritance goods flowing through the market now. A man has a stall where he sells items from abandoned houses, dishes, clothing, furniture, tools. It's technically legal, these things having been declared ownerless after their owners died without heirs. But it feels ghoulish somehow. You recognise a blue cloak that once belonged to your neighbour. A set of cooking pots that look like the ones your sister owned. The man selling them is not apologetic. He's performing a service, he says. These things would otherwise rot unused. Better they go to people who need them. He's not wrong, but you still walk past quickly. Unable to look too closely at the goods laid out on his table, the social dynamics of the market have shifted. Before the plague, there was a clear hierarchy. Wealthy merchants in their fine clothes buying first and best, then craftsmen, then labourers, then beggars hoping for scraps. Now the distinctions blur. The wealthy merchant might be dead, his wife now shopping with limited funds. The labourer, if he survived, might have steady work and coins in his purse. People who would never have spoken before now stand side by side at stalls, equally desperate, equally calculating their resources. You notice something else. The conversations are shorter, less social. Before, the market was a place to exchange news and gossip, to maintain social connections, to linger and chat. Now people conduct their business quickly and leave. There's an unspoken anxiety, a desire not to be in crowds longer than necessary. Even though most people believe the worst of the plague has passed, the fear remains, woven into the fabric of daily life. You stand too close to someone and they step back, not rudely, just automatically maintaining distance. Touch, casual physical contact has become something to avoid. You hand coins to the vegetable seller and she drops them into a bowl of vinegar before touching them, a folk practice meant to cleanse them of contagion. As you leave the market, your bag lighter than you'd hoped, your purse lighter still, you pass the town fountain where children once played. They're there today too, a small group of them, but they play quietly, without the wild energy you remember. They're playing a game you don't recognise at first, then realise with a chill what it is. They're pretending to be plague doctors, wearing makeshift beak masks made from cloth and sticks, examining each other with exaggerated seriousness. Children process trauma through play, you think. They make sense of their world the only way they know how, and their world, like yours, has been permanently marked by death. Let's talk about the children for a moment. They still play in the streets, because that's what children do. They still chase each other through alleys, still make up games, still laugh. But their games have changed. They play at funerals, taking turns being the corpse, being the priest. They sing songs about death with the same cheerfulness they once sang about spring. They've absorbed the reality of their world with a flexibility that adults cannot match. Some have been orphaned and wander in small groups, feral and hungry, until distant relatives or monasteries take them in. Others have lost siblings, parents. Their resilience is both heartbreaking and inspiring. The mind's capacity to adapt, to continue, even when everything familiar has been taken away. Watch them for a moment, these children of the plague years. A girl of perhaps 8 years old is teaching younger children a rhyme, a sing-song chant that bounces along with disturbing cheerfulness. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. The rosy, she explains to the littlest ones, is the red rash that comes with fever. The posies are the flowers people carry to ward off bad air. Ashes refers to the burning of bodies, or perhaps the phrase chew. Chew from sneezing. And we all fall down. Well, that part is obvious. They hold hands in a circle and spin, then collapse giggling to the ground, playing at the very thing that has destroyed their world. You watch this and don't know whether to laugh or cry. The orphans are everywhere. Some estimates suggest that 1 in 5 children has lost both parents. Extended family takes in what children they can, but the extended family has also been devastated. An uncle who might have taken in his brother's children has 5 children of his own to feed, and his wife is pregnant again because life continues, because that's what humans do. He simply cannot take in 3 more mouths. So the children end up elsewhere. Monasteries and convents, overwhelmed, take in what orphans they can, the boys going to monasteries, the girls to convents. The children are given rudimentary education, taught to read Latin, put to work in gardens and kitchens and scriptoriums. For some, it's a better life than they would have had otherwise. For others, it's a sentence of loneliness and labour. But many orphans fall through the cracks entirely. They band together in small groups for protection and survival, living rough in abandoned buildings, stealing food from markets, begging from church doors. They're wild in a way that disturbs the remaining adults, feral children raised without supervision or guidance, forming their own societies with their own rules. Some cities try to round them up, to place them in institutions or apprenticeships by force. Others largely ignore them, too overwhelmed by their own survival to deal with this secondary crisis. A few of these orphan children thrive, in their way, learning to be cunning, resourceful, tough. Most simply endure, damaged by trauma in ways that will affect them for life. The children who still have at least one parent often carry responsibilities far beyond their years. A 10-year-old boy whose father died now does his father's work, apprenticed to a blacksmith or a carpenter, supporting his mother and younger siblings. A 12-year-old girl whose mother died now runs the household, caring for younger children, cooking, cleaning, managing what little money the family has. They grow up fast, these children, or they don't grow up at all. Childhood as a protected, innocent phase of life, already brief in medieval society, becomes briefer still, compressed into a few years before adult responsibilities descend. Yet children's capacity for adaptation is remarkable. They accept the new reality with less resistance than adults, because they have less investment in the old one. A child whose entire family died might, within months, be happily playing with other children, seemingly adjusted, only revealing the deeper trauma in nightmares or sudden moments of grief that overwhelm them without warning. They learn to live with loss in a way that adults struggle to do. They compartmentalize. They focus on immediate concerns. They find joy in small things, because they haven't yet learned that joy is supposed to be impossible. Their education suffers dramatically. The schools, often run by monasteries or churches, have lost teachers to plague. The priests who taught Latin and scripture are dead, and their replacements, hastily ordained men with minimal training, often lack the knowledge or inclination to teach. The grammar schools in cities close or operate sporadically. For the children of peasants, education was never a priority anyway, but even the informal transmission of knowledge, fathers teaching sons their trade, mothers teaching daughters household skills, has been disrupted by death. A generation is growing up less skilled, less literate, less connected to the accumulated knowledge of previous generations, but they're also growing up with a different understanding of the world. They've seen that death is random, that virtue doesn't protect you, that authority figures, priests, nobles, parents, are as vulnerable as anyone else. This breeds a certain skepticism, a questioning attitude that might not have emerged otherwise. They're more likely to challenge authority, to ask why, to insist on explanations rather than accepting pronouncements. This subtle shift in mentality, multiplied across a generation, will contribute to the intellectual ferment of the coming Renaissance. Though no one in 1350 could possibly predict this. You watch a group of children playing in a courtyard. They're building something from sticks and mud, chattering to each other in high, clear voices. One laughs at something another said. One trips and scrapes his knee and cries briefly before being comforted by the others. They look like children anywhere, any time. And then you notice what they're building. A miniature cemetery, complete with tiny stick crosses marking tiny graves. They're burying stones wrapped in cloth, solemn-faced, speaking words they've heard at too many real funerals. And then, project complete, they immediately abandon it and run off to play chase, the game already forgotten, their attention elsewhere. The adults carry grief like stones in their pockets, heavy and constant. Children carry it too, but differently, setting it down and picking it up again, able somehow to live alongside it without being crushed. When you most need spiritual guidance, something terrible happens. Many priests flee. It's not that they're cowards, though some certainly are, but that they're human. They watch their fellow clergy die after administering last rites, after touching the sick, after breathing the same air. Some leave their parishes in the night, disappearing into the countryside. Others stay, but from a distance shouting prayers from outside marked houses, refusing to enter. A few, a remarkable few, stay and do their duty. They visit the dying, hear confessions, offer what comfort they can, These men become heroes, though many of them don't survive their heroism. The shortage of priests becomes so severe that the church begins ordaining men with minimal training, sometimes barely literate, just to fill the void. The parish priest occupies a unique position in medieval society. He's the intermediary between the people and God, the one who can perform the sacraments that ensure salvation. Without a priest, you cannot receive communion, cannot have your sins formally absolved, cannot be properly married or buried. The priest's role goes beyond spiritual matters. He is often the only literate person in a village, serving as scribe, record keeper, mediator of disputes, source of news from the wider world. When he dies or flees, the community loses not just spiritual leadership but practical support. The mortality rate among priests is catastrophically high, possibly higher than among the general population. This makes sense when you think about it. Priests are called to the bedsides of the dying. They lean close to hear whispered confessions. They administer last rites, touching the sick with consecrated oil. They breathe the same air. If the plague is pneumonic, spreading through coughing, they're exposed repeatedly and at close range. Even the bubonic form, spreading through fleas, finds easy transmission when a priest visits multiple sick households in a single day, his robes potentially carrying infected fleas from house to house. Some priests recognize the danger and make a terrible choice. They flee. They rationalize it in various ways. They're needed elsewhere. They'll die if they stay, and then who will serve the living? God will understand. But the rationalizations ring hollow when their parishioners, the people who trusted them, who believed they would be there in the darkest hour, find themselves abandoned. Stories spread of priests loading their possessions onto carts in the middle of the night and disappearing before dawn. Of priests refusing to hear the confessions of plague victims, shouting absolution through closed doors rather than entering contaminated houses. The scandal is immense. Faith in the church, already sometimes strained, suffers damage that will take generations to repair. Other priests modify their practices in ways that maintain some distance. They hear confessions from several feet away rather than in the traditional close whisper. They administer last rites quickly, spending minimal time with each patient. They touch the sick with long sticks rather than their bare hands, dabbing holy oil from a distance. These compromises save some priestly lives while still providing some spiritual service, but they feel inadequate, empty. The dying want human connection in their final moments, want someone to hold their hand, to look them in the eye, to assure them that they're not dying alone. A priest standing at the doorway, blessing them from 10 feet away, cannot provide this comfort. And then there are the heroes, the priests who stay, who do their duty fully, who sit with the dying and hold their hands and pray with them until the end. Many of these men die. Some survive through what seems like divine intervention or simply incredible luck. These survivors carry a moral authority, a respect that cannot be purchased or inherited. Everyone knows who stayed and who fled. The priest who remained at his post through the worst months, who buried the dead with his own hands when there was no one else, who comforted the grieving even while grieving himself. This man becomes a living saint in his community's eyes, but there aren't enough of these heroes. The shortage of priests becomes critical by 1350. The church responds by lowering standards dramatically. Men who would normally require years of training are ordained after weeks. The requirements for literacy, normally a priest should read Latin fluently, understand theology, know the liturgy by heart, are quietly relaxed. Some of the hastily ordained clergy can barely read at all. They stumble through the Latin Mass, mispronouncing words, sometimes inadvertently saying something heretical because they don't understand what they're reading. The quality of spiritual leadership declines noticeably. This creates its own problems. Parishioners accustomed to educated, competent priests now find themselves led by men barely more learned than themselves. Respect for the clergy declines further. Some of the new priests are corrupt, using their position for personal gain, demanding excessive fees for sacraments, living openly with women despite vows of celibacy. The church hierarchy, decimated and disorganized, struggles to maintain discipline. Bishops are dead or overwhelmed. The normal mechanisms of oversight have broken down. There's also a question of divine protection that troubles everyone. If priests, the holiest members of society, are dying at such high rates, what does that mean? Shouldn't God protect his servants? The fact that he apparently doesn't suggests either that God has withdrawn his favour from the church, a disturbing thought, or that holiness provides no protection from plague, which suggests the plague is natural rather than supernatural, which is equally disturbing in a different way. Either answer undermines the spiritual certainty that medieval Christianity depends on. You go to church on Sunday, as you always have, as everyone is expected to. The building is less full than it once was, half the congregation is dead, and some survivors have stopped attending, their faith shaken or simply their energy too depleted for observances. The priest who leads the service is young, clearly nervous, stumbling over the Latin prayers. He's the third priest this parish has had in 2 years. The first died in the initial wave of plague. The second fled. This one is new, ordained hastily, trying his best. You want to respect him, to find comfort in the familiar rituals, but it's hard. The Mass feels mechanical, empty. When you go forward for communion, when the young priest places the wafer on your tongue with shaking hands, you feel nothing. The magic, the sense of holy presence seems to have departed. You return to your pew and kneel and try to pray, but the words feel like they're disappearing into empty air, unheard, unanswered. The graveyards fill quickly, then they overflow. At first, people try to maintain traditions, individual burials, prayers, proper ceremony. But the numbers make this impossible. Soon, they're digging massive pits, plague pits, and filling them with layers of bodies like some grim human harvest. Lime is poured between the layers to speed decomposition, to mask the smell. The living stop looking too closely, stop thinking too hard about the faces disappearing into the earth. There's a story from London of a cemetery where they stacked bodies so high and so quickly that the ground level rose by several feet. Years later, when people walked across it, they could feel the earth shift beneath their feet, still settling, still digesting its burden. The churchyard cemetery attached to your parish church has space for perhaps 200 burials in a normal generation. In normal times, you might have 3 or 4 funerals a month. The sexton, the man responsible for digging graves and maintaining the cemetery, can handle this easily. He digs graves 3 or 4 feet deep, places the body in a wooden coffin or wrapped in a shroud, covers it with earth, marks it with a wooden cross or a stone if the family can afford one. The process is respectful, individual, acknowledging the unique humanity of the deceased. By the summer of 1348, the sexton is burying 3 or 4 bodies a day. Within a month, he's burying 10 or 12. The careful individual graves become impossible. There's no time, no space, no energy. He starts digging larger holes, trenches really, laying bodies side by side with minimal separation. Then he starts stacking them, one body atop another, separated by thin layers of earth. The wooden coffins, expensive and time-consuming to build, are abandoned. Bodies go into the ground wrapped only in shrouds, sometimes not even that, just the clothes they died in, or naked if their clothes have been taken for reuse. The sexton himself eventually dies. His assistant takes over, then dies. Eventually, it's whoever can be conscripted or hired for the work. Gravediggers become some of the highest paid workers in the city, not because the job requires skill, but because no one wants to do it. The work is exhausting, the graves are deep, and there's the constant fear of infection from handling dead bodies. The men who do this work are often drunk, numbing themselves with ale or wine just to get through the day. They become rough, irreverent, losing respect for the dead out of sheer psychological necessity. You can't dig 50 graves a day while maintaining reverent mourning for each one. The mind can't sustain that much grief. The smell becomes unbearable. Even with lime, Even with earth covering the bodies, the cemetery reeks of death and decay. The smell carries on the wind to nearby houses, to the church itself. People begin to complain, not about the deaths, those are unavoidable, but about the smell, about the flies, about the rats that gather in increasing numbers. The church authorities, what's left of them, recognise they have a problem. The churchyard cemeteries simply cannot hold any more bodies. They're full, beyond full, and the plague shows no sign of stopping. So new sites are established, emergency burial grounds outside the city walls. These aren't blessed churchyards with centuries of history. They're just empty fields, hastily consecrated by whoever can perform the ceremony, converted overnight into mass graves. The bodies come in carts, dozens at a time, jumbled together. Workers dig enormous pits, 20 feet wide, 30 feet long, 10 feet deep. The bodies are laid in layers with lime spread between them. A layer of bodies, a layer of lime and earth. Another layer of bodies, another layer of lime and earth. The pits fill rapidly. When one is full, another is started beside it. There's no record keeping, no way to know who's buried where. In normal times, burial records are carefully maintained. Name, date, location in the churchyard. These records serve important legal purposes, proving someone is dead so their estate can be settled. But now there's no time, no system, no one to do the recording. Bodies go into the pits anonymously. Families have no idea where their loved ones are buried. There's no specific grave to visit, no place to lay flowers, no marker to say, here lies my mother, my son, my wife. The dead simply disappear into the earth, becoming indistinguishable from all the other dead. Some cities establish rules about the burial pits. Bodies must be covered with at least 2 feet of earth. Pits must be a certain distance from wells to avoid contaminating water. No one is to be buried who still shows signs of life. These rules are frequently ignored. The workers are overwhelmed, exhausted, trying to get through each day without thinking too much about what they're doing. Mistakes happen. Stories circulate of people being buried alive, mistaken for dead, because they were unconscious or in a coma. Whether these stories are true or apocryphal, they add another layer of horror to an already horrific situation. The worst task is dealing with bodies when there aren't enough living people to handle them properly. In some houses, entire families die with no one to report their deaths. The bodies lie where they fell for days or weeks, until the smell alerts neighbours or authorities. These corpses, decaying in summer heat, swollen and blackened, have to be removed. The men who do this work, usually criminals given the choice between this job and execution, wear cloth soaked in vinegar over their faces, but it's never enough. The smell penetrates everything. They report nightmares for years afterward, if they survive, of pulling apart bodies that have begun to merge with the furniture they died on, of the sounds and sights and smells that cannot be forgotten no matter how much you drink or pray or try to push them from your mind. You stand at the edge of one of the new burial grounds on a grey autumn morning. The pit in front of you is perhaps half full, bodies visible at the bottom, though you try not to look too closely. A cart arrives with more dead, and workers, their faces wrapped, their movements mechanical with exhaustion, begin unloading. They handle the bodies without ceremony, without gentleness, because there is no other way to do this work and remain sane. You've come because you think your brother might be here, buried somewhere in this anonymous field. But there's no way to know. No one can tell you. You stand for a moment trying to say a prayer, but no words come. Finally, you simply turn and walk away, leaving your brother to his mass grave, to his unmarked rest, to the company of thousands of strangers with whom he'll spend eternity. And then, almost suddenly, you realize you're still alive. Your neighbor is dead. Your cousin is dead. The family 3 doors down, all of them, gone. But you're still here. You woke up this morning and felt no fever, saw no swellings. At first there's relief so powerful it almost feels like joy. And then comes something darker. Why did you survive when better people didn't? Was it random? Was it God's will? And if it was God's will, what does that mean about your purpose, your worth? Some survivors throw themselves into prayer, into charity, trying to prove they deserve to live. Others spiral into depression, into drink, into a kind of reckless hedonism, born from the knowledge that tomorrow is never guaranteed. The guilt arrives in waves, unexpected and overwhelming. You'll be doing something mundane, eating breakfast, walking to work, and suddenly you're struck by the impossibility of your survival. Your wife is dead. Your 2 children are dead. Your parents, your brother, your sister, all dead. 11 people who shared your blood, who lived in the same house or nearby, who breathed the same air and drank from the same well and ate food prepared in the same kitchen, all dead. And you somehow remain. How is that possible? What makes you different? What makes you worthy? The religious explanations offer no comfort. If God chose to spare you, it means God chose not to spare them. It means your life has more value than theirs, which you know to be false. Your wife was kind and generous. Your daughter was innocent, only 6 years old, hadn't had time to commit any sins worthy of divine punishment. If their deaths were God's will, then God's will is incomprehensible, possibly cruel. If their deaths were random, meaningless, then where is God at all? Either answer leads to a crisis of faith that sits in your chest like a stone. Some survivors respond by redoubling their religious devotion. They reason that God must have spared them for a purpose. Therefore, they must live lives of exceptional virtue to justify their survival. They give away their possessions to the poor. They pray for hours each day. They volunteer to care for the sick, to bury the dead, to do the dangerous work that others avoid. This is partly genuine religious feeling and partly a desperate attempt to earn their survival retroactively, to make sense of the randomness by creating purpose from it. If they can do enough good, maybe their survival will have meaning. Maybe their dead loved ones' deaths will have meaning. Others respond oppositely, abandoning faith entirely or descending into nihilistic hedonism. They reason that if death is random and imminent, then life should be lived for immediate pleasure. The moral codes they grew up with, the promises of heavenly reward and hellish punishment, seem empty when you've watched the virtuous die horribly and the wicked survive. They spend their inheritance money on wine and prostitutes. They gamble recklessly. They fight in taverns. They pursue every sensual pleasure available, not out of joy, but out of a kind of desperate defiance. Tomorrow might bring death, so tonight must be lived fully, intensely, without restraint. The psychological weight of loss on this scale is almost impossible to process. Grief is a natural human emotion, but it's meant to be experienced in manageable doses. You lose a loved one, you mourn, you slowly recover, you continue living. But when you lose everyone, when there's no time to mourn one person before losing the next, when the grief simply accumulates day after day with no release, the mind breaks down. Some survivors report feeling numb, emotionally dead, incapable of feeling anything at all. They go through the motions of living, eating, working, sleeping, but it's automatic, mechanical. They're present but not really alive. Others experience what we might now recognize as post-traumatic stress. They startle at sudden sounds. They have nightmares every night. Always the same images. The swollen buboes, the faces of their dead children, the carts carrying bodies through the streets. They avoid places associated with trauma, which in practice means avoiding most of the city. They have panic attacks when they see someone cough or feel the slightest fever. The world has become a place of danger, and their bodies remain in a state of high alert long after the immediate threat has passed. The survivors also face practical challenges that compound the psychological ones. Property and inheritance laws assume that death happens in an orderly fashion, that estates can be settled with time and careful legal work. But when entire families die simultaneously, when multiple potential heirs are all dead, when records are lost or incomplete, the legal system collapses. You might be the last surviving member of a large extended family, suddenly wealthy with properties and goods you never expected to inherit. But this wealth brings no joy. It's blood money, inheritance from the dead, a constant reminder of who's missing. You move into your brother's house because it's larger than yours, and every room echoes with absence. His furniture, his tools, his clothes still hanging in the wardrobe. You should probably sell these things or give them away, but you can't bring yourself to do it. They're all that remains of him. Some survivors experience a peculiar phenomenon. They feel that they're living on borrowed time, that they should have died, and by some mistake didn't. This creates a sense of unreality, a feeling of being a ghost in their own life. They make decisions differently, taking risks they wouldn't have before because death feels arbitrary anyway. Or they become paralyzed with caution, terrified that the mistake will be corrected, that death will find them after all. They check themselves constantly for symptoms. Every ache, every moment of tiredness, every passing fever becomes potential evidence that the plague has finally come for them. The guilt is perhaps strongest when survivors find themselves experiencing moments of happiness. You laugh at a joke someone tells in a tavern, then immediately feel crushing shame. How dare you laugh when your children are dead? You enjoy a meal, savouring fresh bread and cheese, then hate yourself for taking pleasure in anything. You notice a woman, feel a spark of attraction, and are horrified by your own capacity for desire when your wife has been dead for less than a year. The guilt says you should suffer constantly, that any moment not spent in grief is a betrayal of the dead. But humans cannot sustain unrelenting suffering. Joy breaks through despite everything, and then guilt punishes you for that joy, creating a cycle of emotion that's almost impossible to escape. You sit alone in your house as evening falls, not bothering to light a candle. The darkness is appropriate, fits your mood. You think about your daughter's laugh, how it sounded like bells. You think about your wife's hand in yours, the familiar weight and warmth of it. You think about your son teaching his younger sister to skip stones on the river. All of this is gone, will never happen again. You're still here. You survived. And you don't know why or what you're supposed to do with this continued existence. The silence in the house is absolute. No one will call you to dinner. No one will ask about your day. You're alone, one survivor among many. All of you carrying the same impossible weight, trying to find reasons to continue in a world that took everything that made life worth living. Let's talk about the work that continues in the darkness, the jobs no one wants to discuss. Someone has to remove the waste from cesspits. Someone has to carry away the bodies that families can't afford to bury. These men, already at the bottom of society's hierarchy, become both essential and untouchable. They move through the streets at night, their carts creaking, their faces wrapped in cloth against the smell. Most people won't look at them directly, won't speak to them. They're paid better now, labour shortage, remember, but they're also marked by their work in a way that will follow them, even if they try to change professions. They know the city's dark secrets, have seen inside every house, have carried away its most intimate losses. Medieval cities produce waste, human waste, animal waste, garbage in enormous quantities. In normal times, this waste is managed through a combination of systems. Those who can afford it have private cesspits beneath their houses, essentially holes in the ground lined with stone or wood where excrement and urine collect. These pits need to be emptied periodically by men called gong firmers or night soil collectors. The work is disgusting. Climbing into a pit full of human waste, bucketing it out, loading it onto carts so it's done at night when most people are asleep and won't have to see or smell it. The waste is then transported outside the city walls and sold to farmers as fertiliser or dumped into rivers. Those who can't afford private cesspits use public latrines or simply dump their chamber pots into the street drains, which theoretically carry waste away, but often just create open sewers running down the centres of streets. The whole system is barely adequate in the best of times. During the plague, it collapses. The night soil collectors are dying like everyone else. The waste accumulates, cesspits overflow, flooding cellars with sewage, streets become impassable, thick with filth. The smell becomes so overwhelming that people soak cloths in vinegar and hold them over their faces when they go outside. But the work must be done, so those night soil collectors who survive find themselves suddenly valuable. They can demand wages 5 or 10 times what they earned before. Property owners, desperate to have their cesspits emptied, pay whatever is asked. The collectors work longer hours, visiting more houses, struggling to keep up with demand. They form small crews, usually men who worked together before, who trust each other enough to share this awful labour. They develop their own rituals and superstitions, wearing specific amulets, saying certain prayers, drinking heavily before and after work to sterilize themselves from the inside, they believe. The body collectors, or corpse carriers, face even worse conditions. These are the men hired to remove bodies from houses where everyone has died, where corpses have lain for days or weeks because no one knew they were there. The decay in summer heat is indescribable. Bodies bloat and rupture, fluids leak, maggots swarm. The men doing this work are often criminals, given the choice between this or hanging, between this or permanent exile. They're paid extremely well by plague year standards, but they're also completely ostracised. No one will share a drink with them. No church wants them in the congregation. They're seen as contaminated, tainted by their proximity to so much death. These men develop a gallows humour that would shock anyone who overheard it. They make jokes about the corpses, give them nicknames, treat the whole thing as black comedy, because the alternative is madness. They drink constantly, not just to numb themselves, but because alcohol is believed to prevent infection. Many of them die anyway, from disease or from alcohol poisoning, or from accidents when exhaustion makes them careless. Those who survive are changed permanently. Several accounts exist from the period of body collectors who do their work for a year, earn enough money to live comfortably, then cannot return to normal life. They're unable to sleep without drinking themselves unconscious. They're unable to form relationships. They're haunted by what they've seen in ways that don't fade with time. The work creates a strange intimacy with death. These men see people at their absolute worst. They're most vulnerable. They're most undignified. They enter homes where families died together, where you can see the progression of disease through the house. The father died first in the main room. The mother died a few days later in the bedroom. The children died last of all in their small sleeping space. They see the desperate last acts of the dying, messages scratched on walls, prayers written in shaking handwriting, valuable items hidden in the hope that someone might find them. Sometimes they take these items, justifying it as payment for their awful work. Sometimes they leave them, disturbed by the intimacy of the theft. The social stigma attached to this work is powerful and persistent. A man who spends a year collecting corpses cannot simply return to his previous life when the plague ends. Everyone knows what he did. They remember seeing him on the streets at night, loading bodies onto carts. They remember the smell that followed him. Even though he performed essential work, even though without him the city would have drowned in corpses, he's marked forever. He cannot find regular work. No one wants to employ him. He cannot marry. No respectable family will let their daughter near him. He exists in a permanent underclass, too valuable to execute, but too contaminated to fully reintegrate. Some of these men band together, forming communities of fellow outcasts. They continue doing dirty work, clearing out cesspits, handling dead animals, anything no one else will do because they have no other options. They develop their own culture, their own code of honour, their own hierarchy. Within their group, the work is respected, understood. They share techniques for managing the psychological burden, for coping with trauma that no one outside their circle can comprehend. In a few cities, these outcast communities persist for generations, sons inheriting their father's profession, not by choice, but by lack of alternatives. You pass one of these men on the street late one evening. He's pushing a cart, its contents covered with a stained cloth, moving toward the cemetery. You know what's under that cloth. You know what he does. You look away quickly, pretending you didn't see him. He notices. They always notice. But his face shows no reaction. He's used to it, the averted eyes, the way people cross to the other side of the street when they see him coming. He continues pushing his cart, its wheels squeaking with each rotation, the sound echoing off the dark buildings. You feel a complicated mixture of gratitude and revulsion. Someone has to do this work. You're glad it's not you. You're grateful someone is willing. But you cannot bring yourself to acknowledge him, to meet his eyes, to treat him as fully human. And this failure of compassion, small as it is, adds one more weight to the moral burden you carry as a survivor. When you step into a tavern in the second year of the plague, the atmosphere is strange. The crowd is smaller, of course. Half the tables sit empty. But those who are there drink with an intensity that wasn't present before. There's laughter, yes, but it has a manic edge. Stories are told, jokes are made, some so dark they would have been unthinkable before. There's a sense of defiance in the air, a determination to find joy wherever it can be found, to steal moments of pleasure from a world that seems bent on taking everything. The tavern keeper, if he's survived, pours generous measures. Everyone pays cash now. Credit and promises mean nothing when death can claim your debtor overnight. The tavern has always been a central institution in medieval life, serving functions beyond just selling alcohol. It's a social centre, a place to hear news, to conduct business, to escape the confines of crowded houses. For working men, it's the closest thing to a private space they have. At home, they're surrounded by family, by children, by the demands of domestic life. In the tavern, they can be themselves, can speak freely, can relax. The plague hasn't eliminated the need for this space. If anything, it's made it more essential. But the tavern's character has changed. Before the plague, there was a predictable rhythm to tavern life. Men came after work, had a drink or two, shared conversation, went home. The atmosphere was convivial, sometimes rowdy, but fundamentally stable. Now there's desperation to the drinking, a need to obliterate consciousness, to forget for a few hours what life has become. Men drink until they're insensible, collapsing at tables or being carried out by friends. The tavern keeper, who once would have cut them off, now keeps pouring. He needs the money, they need the oblivion, and who is he to judge? The conversations are different too. Before, men talked about work, about local gossip, about sports and games. Now every conversation eventually circles back to the plague. Who's died? Who's sick? Whether it's getting better or worse. Theories about causes and cures, most of them nonsense but repeated with absolute conviction. Arguments break out, sometimes turning violent, because everyone is on edge. Everyone's tolerance for disagreement has evaporated. The tavern keeper has to intervene more often, physically separating men who are about to fight over whether garlic or onions are better protection against infection. The humour has become intensely dark. Jokes about death, about corpses, about funerals, things that would have been considered offensive and inappropriate before, are now common currency. A man might quip that he's saving money on funeral expenses by having his whole family die at once. Another might joke that at least the plague has solved the problem of his nagging mother-in-law. The laughter that greets these jokes is uncomfortable, forced, but it's laughter nonetheless. It's a way of asserting control, of saying death doesn't own us completely, we can still mock it. The drinking songs have changed too. The old favourites, bawdy songs about women, drinking songs celebrating the pleasures of ale and wine, are still sung, but new songs have emerged. Some are adapted from the flagellant hymns, the German songs about death and judgment. Others are entirely new, composed by unknown authors, spreading from tavern to tavern, city to city. They're mournful and defiant at once, acknowledging the horror while insisting on continued life. One popular song, sung in slurred voices late at night, goes, "Death comes for beggars, death comes for kings, death comes regardless of earthly things, so drink up, friends, and fill your cup, for death will find us soon enough." The social mixing in taverns has intensified. Before the plague, there were rough social divisions even in these democratic spaces. Craftsmen drank with craftsmen, labourers with labourers, merchants with merchants. Now these boundaries have blurred. A man who was a wealthy merchant a year ago might now be destitute, his business collapsed, his family dead. He drinks alongside day labourers because they're all equally desperate, all equally traumatised. The shared experience of loss creates a temporary equality that wouldn't have existed before. Women are more visible in taverns now too, breaking previous social norms. Widows, particularly, who once would have stayed home in respectable mourning, come to taverns seeking company, seeking distraction from empty houses. Some come looking for new husbands, practical necessity more than romance, needing someone to provide income to help manage property. Others come just to be around people, to hear voices, to remember what it feels like to be part of community. The tavern keeper's wife, if she's survived, often becomes a confidant, listening to stories of loss, offering practical advice, maintaining a feminine presence in an otherwise male space. The economics of tavern keeping have become complicated. On one hand, demand is high. People need alcohol more than ever. On the other hand, supply chains are disrupted. The brewers who made ale are dead or unable to get grain. Wine imports have slowed. The tavern keeper might water down his drinks more than before, and customers might notice but don't complain too much because where else will they go? He extends credit carefully, knowing that debts often go unpaid when creditors die. He accepts payment in goods. A man might trade tools or clothing for drinks when he has no coin. There's also the question of whether to stay open at all. Some tavern keepers close during the worst months, fearing that gathering places spread disease. Others stay open, reasoning that people need this outlet, that closing would drive them to drink alone at home, which might be worse for morale. A few taverns explicitly market themselves as plague-free, claiming to serve only healthy customers, though there's no way to enforce this. Others take the opposite approach, becoming places where the sick and the well mingle freely, where fatalism reigns, where everyone accepts that death might come from any encounter, so why bother being careful? You sit in a corner table with two other men, the remnants of what was once a group of 6 friends who regularly drank together. 3 are dead. The conversation lags, then picks up again, circling familiar territory. Someone proposes a toast to the absent. You raise your cups, speak their names, drink. The ale tastes sour, but you don't comment on it. Outside, darkness has fallen. You should probably go home, but home is empty, silent, unbearable. So you signal the tavern keeper for another round. He brings it. You drink. And for a little while longer, surrounded by the warmth of bodies and the noise of voices, you can almost forget what awaits you in the dark and silent hours before dawn. Trade continues, because human beings need things and desire things, and will find ways to get them even in the worst circumstances. But the merchant class is transforming. Some have died, leaving their businesses to widows who prove surprisingly capable of running them. Others have become wealthy beyond their previous dreams, having bought up the assets of the dead for pennies on the pound. There's a cold pragmatism to commerce in these years. Inheritance laws that once seemed solid now bend under the pressure of so many deaths. Distant cousins suddenly find themselves wealthy. Apprentices inherit entire workshops. The social order is not destroyed, but it's being quietly, relentlessly rearranged. The merchant's life was always one of calculated risk, investing in goods, transporting them, hoping to sell at profit. The plague introduces new variables that make every calculation more uncertain. A merchant might invest heavily in a cargo of wool, only to find that the weavers who would buy it are dead, and the textile workshops have closed. Or he might stock grain expecting scarcity and high prices, only to discover that with fewer people alive, demand is actually lower than supply. The market becomes chaotic, unpredictable, with wild price swings that can make or destroy fortunes overnight. Some merchants respond to this chaos by becoming more conservative, dealing only in essential goods that people need regardless of circumstances: grain, salt, basic cloth. basic tools. These necessities maintain relatively stable demand, and while the profits are smaller, they're more predictable. Other merchants take the opposite approach, becoming speculators who gamble on scarcity and panic. They buy up goods they think will become scarce, candles, medicines, spices, wine, and hoard them waiting for prices to spike. This practice, called engrossing, is technically illegal and considered morally reprehensible, but enforcement is nearly impossible when the authorities are overwhelmed. The widow merchants are a particularly interesting development. Before the plague, women were involved in trade, certainly, helping husbands, running market stalls, but rarely as independent operators. A merchant's wife might manage his business when he travelled, but she did so in his name, under his authority. When he died, the business typically passed to a son or male relative, but now so many men are dead, so many sons are dead, that widows find themselves inheriting by default. Some sell the businesses quickly, unable or unwilling to run them. Others discover they have a talent for commerce that was never previously recognised. These women face significant challenges. Many merchants won't deal with them directly, considering it improper to negotiate with women. Guild regulations in some cities forbid women from holding masterships or taking apprentices, but necessity erodes these restrictions. A textile merchant who refuses to buy from a widow because of her gender will find himself without the cloth he needs, while his competitor, who's less fastidious, secures the goods. Gradually, grudgingly, the commercial world adapts. Some of these widow merchants become quite successful, managing their businesses more effectively than their late husbands did, discovering that their exclusion from male social networks and drinking culture actually helps them focus on the practical matters of trade. The apprentice turned master is another common figure in the post-plague economy. The traditional path to becoming a master merchant or craftsman required years of apprenticeship, then years as a journeyman, then accumulating enough capital to open your own shop or business, a process that might take 20 years or more. But when your master dies and his sons die and his brothers die, and you're the only one left who knows the business, you inherit by default. You might be 25 years old, barely experienced, but suddenly you own a workshop or a trading company. Some of these young masters fail, lacking the knowledge and capital to succeed. Others thrive, bringing new energy and ideas to businesses that had become stagnant. The great merchant families, the ones who dominated trade in the large cities, the Medici in Florence, the Fuggers in Augsburg, and dozens of less famous names, survive the plague better than most. They have country estates where they can retreat when the cities become too dangerous. They have enough wealth to buy the best food, the best medical care available to avoid crowded markets and workshops. But even they lose family members, and their businesses are disrupted. Trade routes that took generations to establish break down when their agents in distant cities die. Credit networks, based on personal relationships and trust, collapse when half the participants are gone. There's also the question of what to do with inherited wealth. A merchant whose 3 brothers died might suddenly find himself wealthy beyond anything he'd imagined, inheriting their shares of the family business. But wealth in a dying world feels empty, purposeless. Some respond by doubling down on accumulation, throwing themselves into work as a distraction from grief, building trading empires because they don't know what else to do with themselves. Others become philanthropic, donating to churches and hospitals, funding masses for the dead, trying to buy meaning for their survival. A few abandon commerce entirely, becoming monks or priests, seeking spiritual answers to questions that business cannot address. The ethics of plague commerce trouble everyone who thinks about it. Is it morally acceptable to profit from others' deaths? To buy a dead man's shop at a fraction of its value because his widow is desperate? To charge high prices for grain when people are starving? The answers vary. Some merchants develop elaborate rationalizations. They're providing essential services. They're taking risks that others won't. The market determines fair prices. Others are plagued by guilt, feeling that their wealth is blood money, that they've prospered while better people died. A few are simply sociopathic, seeing the plague as an opportunity and feeling no guilt whatsoever about exploiting it. The long-term effect on commerce is profound. The breakdown of traditional trading networks forces merchants to be more independent, more entrepreneurial. They can't rely on established relationships when half the people they dealt with are dead. They have to find new suppliers, new customers, new trade routes. This disruption, though painful, also creates opportunities for innovation. New trading companies emerge, organised along different lines. The commercial revolution that will eventually lead to modern capitalism is accelerated by the plague's destruction of the old order. But here's where human nature reveals its darkest face. In the absence of understanding, people need someone to blame, and the blame falls, as it so often does, on those already marginalised. Jewish communities across Europe face accusations of poisoning wells, of causing the plague through some kind of dark magic. It doesn't matter that Jews are dying from the plague at the same rate as everyone else. It doesn't matter that Pope Clement VI publicly declares these accusations false. The pogroms begin. Entire communities are massacred. Survivors flee eastward. It's a reminder that even in the face of a shared enemy, a disease that kills indiscriminately, humans can still find ways to turn on each other, to create hierarchies of suffering, to decide that some deaths matter more than others. The accusations start as whispers, rumours spreading from tavern to market square. Someone claims they saw a Jewish man dropping something into a well. Someone else reports that the Jewish quarter was less affected by plague than Christian neighbourhoods, which proves they must have protection or prior knowledge. The logic is circular and self-fulfilling. Jews are blamed for the plague, therefore anything that happens to them or around them becomes evidence of their guilt. When Jews die from plague, it's claimed they died from their own poison accidentally. When they don't die, it's proof they had the antidote. The well-poisoning accusations are particularly insidious because they play on existing prejudices and fears. Water sources are mysterious. People don't understand where water comes from or how disease spreads, but they know water is essential, and they know it can make you sick if it's bad. The idea that someone could poison a well and thereby kill an entire community is both plausible and terrifying. It provides a simple explanation for a complex disaster. It gives people a target for their rage and fear. And it allows Christian authorities to avoid harder questions about divine punishment or natural causes. The first major pogrom occurs in the spring of 1348 in southern France. A Jewish community in Toulon is accused of poisoning the water supply. A mob forms, attacks the Jewish quarter, kills dozens of people, burns houses. The survivors are expelled from the city. From there, the violence spreads. By summer, Jewish communities in Provence, Languedoc and Catalonia have been attacked. The pattern is grimly consistent. Accusations, mob violence, massacre, expulsion. Sometimes the local authorities try to protect Jewish residents. Sometimes they participate in the violence. Sometimes they simply stand aside and let it happen. The worst pogroms occur in Germanic lands in 1348 and 1349. In Strasbourg, the entire Jewish community, approximately 2,000 people, is herded into a wooden building in the Jewish cemetery and burned alive. The land and property of the murdered Jews is divided among Christian creditors and city officials, revealing the economic motivations behind the religious pretext. In Mainz, Jews barricade themselves in their quarter and fight back, killing 200 attackers before being overwhelmed. The entire community is massacred, 6,000 people. In Basel, Jews are locked in a wooden building on an island in the Rhine, and the building is set afire. Those who try to escape by jumping in the river are pushed back into the flames with poles. Pope Clement VI issues 2 papal bulls, one in July 1348, another in September 1349, explicitly condemning the persecution of Jews. He points out that Jews are dying from the plague in regions where there are no Jews. The Jews are clearly dying from the plague themselves, that blaming them makes no logical sense. He threatens excommunication for anyone who murders Jews without legal trial. His intervention saves some lives, particularly in regions where local bishops enforce his decrees, but it's largely ineffective against mob violence. The mobs don't care about papal pronouncements. They want blood, want revenge, want someone to punish for the catastrophe. The economic dimensions of the pogroms are impossible to ignore. Jews in medieval Europe are often moneylenders, one of the few professions Christians consider appropriate for them, since charging interest is forbidden to Christians by church law. This means many Christians owe debts to Jewish lenders. Killing your creditor and seizing his property is an effective, if horrific, way to eliminate debt. City governments, facing financial crisis from reduced tax revenue due to population loss, seize Jewish property and assets after pogroms, temporarily solving budget shortfalls. Individual Christians take over Jewish homes and businesses. The religious justification, punishing those who killed Christ, who poisoned wells, who caused the plague, provides moral cover for what is essentially theft and murder. Not everyone participates or approves. Some Christians hide Jewish neighbours, help them escape, testify to their innocence. Some city councils resist the pressure to expel or massacre their Jewish populations, recognising both the moral wrong and the economic damage it would cause. In a few places, Jewish communities successfully defend themselves with arms, fighting off mobs and negotiating protection agreements with local authorities. But these are exceptions. The overwhelming pattern is violence, displacement and death. The long-term consequences reshape European Jewish life for centuries. The Jewish population of Central Europe is devastated. Entire communities that had existed for hundreds of years are destroyed. The survivors flee eastward, particularly to Poland and Lithuania, where local nobles offer protection in exchange for Jewish economic expertise. This migration creates the concentration of Ashkenazi Jewish population in Eastern Europe that persists until the Holocaust. It also reinforces Christian stereotypes of Jews as wandering, rootless, untrustworthy, stereotypes that emerge from Christian violence but are then blamed on Jewish character. The pogroms also reveal something disturbing about human psychology under stress. When people are terrified, when they're watching their families die from something they can't understand or control, they become capable of enormous cruelty. The need to blame someone, to find meaning in randomness, to exercise power in a situation where they feel powerless. These drives can override compassion, override reason, override basic human decency. The same people who massacre their Jewish neighbours on Tuesday would have shared bread with them on Monday, might resume normal relations with survivors on Wednesday if authorities force them to. You watch from a distance as a Jewish family leaves the city, expelled by official decree following accusations they can't defend against. They're loading their possessions onto a cart, what little they're allowed to take. The father looks stunned, disbelieving. He's lived his entire life in this city, as did his father and grandfather. The children are crying, confused about why they have to leave, where they're going. You know this family slightly. The father once lent you money when you were desperate, at fair terms, without condescension. You want to say something, to acknowledge the injustice, to apologise on behalf of your fellow Christians. But you don't. You're afraid of being associated with them, of drawing suspicion onto yourself, so you look away, as most people are doing. And in your silence, in everyone's silence, you're complicit. The cart creaks away down the road, heading east, heading toward an uncertain future, and you turn back to your own concerns, carrying the small weight of this moral failure along with all the others. In a few places, something remarkable happens. Observant officials begin to notice patterns. The disease seems to spread where people gather, where the sick mix with the healthy, and so they try something new. They close the city gates. They forbid ships to dock for 40 days, 40 giorni in Italian, which is where our word quarantine comes from. They seal houses where the sick live, marking them with crosses, forbidding anyone to enter or leave. It's cruel. Families starve inside sealed houses. The healthy sometimes die trapped with the sick. But in some places it works. The spread slows. Not everyone accepts this. There are riots, breakouts, acts of desperate defiance. But it's the beginning of something important. The understanding that isolation, for all its cruelty, can sometimes save more lives than it costs. The city of Ragusa, in what is now Croatia, implements one of the first formal quarantine systems in 1377, several decades after the first plague outbreak, but in response to recurring waves. Ships arriving from plague-affected regions must anchor in a designated harbour and wait 30 days, later extended to 40, before anyone can disembark or cargo can be unloaded. Guards enforce this ruthlessly. Captains who try to land elsewhere are executed. The 40-day period is chosen partly for practical reasons. Plague symptoms typically appear within that time frame, and partly for religious symbolism, 40 being a significant number in Christian theology. Venice, Milan, and other Italian city-states develop increasingly sophisticated quarantine protocols. They establish lazarettos, special islands or isolated compounds where travellers and goods from suspicious regions are held for observation. These facilities are deliberately located away from population centres, usually on islands or outside city walls. The conditions are grim: crowded dormitories, minimal food, no medical care beyond basic observation. People who enter healthy sometimes leave sick, having contracted plague from others held in the same facility, but the system does reduce transmission into the general population, which is its intended purpose. The household quarantine, sealing sick families inside their homes, is even more controversial. When plague is confirmed in a house, authorities nail the doors shut from the outside and paint a large cross on the door, sometimes with the words, "Lord have mercy on us." A guard is posted to prevent escape. Food and water are supposed to be delivered, but this doesn't always happen reliably. The healthy family members, trapped inside with the sick, almost inevitably become infected. They listen to their loved ones die, watch disease progress through the household, wait for their own symptoms to appear, knowing no one will help them, knowing they'll die trapped and alone. The cruelty of this system generates significant resistance. Families sometimes break out, battering down doors, overpowering guards, fleeing to relatives or into the countryside. Neighbours, hearing the screams and pleas from sealed houses, sometimes help them escape out of compassion or guilt. Guards assigned to prevent escape are often reluctant to enforce orders too strictly. These are their neighbours, people they know, and maintaining the seal means condemning them to death. The system only works when authorities are willing to use harsh penalties against those who break quarantine or help others do so. Some cities implement broader lockdowns, essentially quarantining entire neighbourhoods or the whole city. Gates are locked, travel is forbidden, markets are suspended except for essential food sales. These lockdowns are almost impossible to maintain for long periods. People need to work, need to earn money, need to buy food. A city under lockdown begins to starve, begins to run out of fuel and supplies, begins to see its economy collapse. The lockdowns are typically brief, a few weeks, just enough to interrupt transmission chains without causing total social breakdown. The understanding of contagion that drives these quarantine measures is imperfect but improving. Physicians and officials notice that people who care for the sick tend to become sick themselves. They notice that disease spreads along trade routes, that ships from infected ports bring infection to previously healthy ports. They don't understand the mechanism. Bacteria and fleas and rats are not part of their conceptual framework, but they can observe patterns and act on them. This empirical, observation-based approach is actually quite sophisticated for the 14th century, representing a move toward proto-scientific thinking. Not everyone accepts these measures. Many people believe plague is divine punishment, which means quarantine is theologically problematic. If God wills you to have plague, sealing yourself away won't help. If God wills you to be healthy, you don't need quarantine. From this perspective, isolation measures represent a lack of faith, a reliance on human action rather than divine will. Priests often preach against quarantine, arguing that Christians should trust in God and show charity to the sick rather than avoiding them. The tension between religious duty and self-preservation becomes a major ethical debate. The practical effectiveness of quarantine varies enormously. In cities with strong government, good record-keeping, and effective enforcement, it demonstrably reduces plague transmission. Milan, which implements strict quarantine and isolation measures early and enforces them ruthlessly, suffers less severely than other Italian cities of comparable size. But in cities with weak or corrupt government, where enforcement is spotty and people can easily bribe their way out of isolation, quarantine is nearly useless. It becomes theatre, a performance of action that doesn't actually interrupt transmission. The social impact is profound. Quarantine reinforces the breakdown of community trust and mutual obligation that the plague has already started. Traditionally, Christians are obligated to care for the sick, to visit the afflicted, to provide comfort. Quarantine explicitly forbids this, turning Christian charity into a criminal act. Neighbours who once would have helped each other are now separated by law and by fear. The sick die alone, without the comfort of family or priest. The erosion of social bonds already underway accelerates dramatically. There's also a class dimension. The wealthy can escape quarantine by leaving the city entirely, relocating to country estates, travelling to regions not yet affected. The poor have no such option. They remain in the city subject to quarantine enforcement, unable to leave even if they wanted to. The quarantine house ceiling falls disproportionately on poor neighbourhoods, where authorities feel less need to be gentle or compassionate. A wealthy merchant who contracts plague might be quarantined in his comfortable house with servants to care for him. A poor labourer is locked in a single-room dwelling with his entire family, left to die without assistance. You watch as guards seal the house across the street from yours. The family inside, you know them. The father is a carpenter. The mother takes in laundry. They have 4 children, begs not to be locked in. They claim only one child is sick. The others are healthy. Please let them out. The guards, looking uncomfortable but following orders, nail the door shut anyway. They paint a white cross on the door. They post a guard and leave. You listen through the night as the family inside cries and pleads and eventually falls silent. Over the next week you hear occasional sounds, crying, a woman's voice praying, a child calling for help. Then silence. When they finally open the house 10 days later, everyone inside is dead. The guards drag out the bodies and pile them onto a cart. Your neighbour's house stands empty now, door hanging open, no one willing to move into a space so marked by death. And you wonder if this cruelty was necessary, if it saved lives in the aggregate, if the calculus of sacrificing one family to protect others is justified. The questions have no comfortable answers, so as you settle into your own moment in time, let the medieval world fade gently into the darkness behind your closed eyes. Let those narrow streets empty. Let the church bells fall silent. Let the physicians in their strange masks step back into history, where they belong. You've walked through a world that existed 7 centuries ago, a world that watched half its people disappear within the span of a few terrible years. You've seen how ordinary life continued, how bread was still baked, how markets still opened, how children still played, even as the ground filled with graves. You've witnessed both the worst and the best of human nature, the scapegoating and the selfless courage, the panic and the persistence, the way people found reasons to keep going when every reason seemed to have been taken away. The Black Death changed everything it touched. It ended the medieval world and began something new. It shook the foundations of feudalism, shifted the balance of power between lords and peasants, accelerated the rise of a merchant class, questioned the authority of institutions that seemed unshakable. It changed art and literature, making them darker, more focused on mortality, more aware of life's fragility. It contributed to religious upheavals that wouldn't fully manifest for another 2 centuries. The world that emerged from the plague years was fundamentally different from the one that entered them. But perhaps the most important lesson from those years is simply this: humans endure. They adapt. They find ways to remain human even in inhuman circumstances. They bake bread and tell jokes and fall in love and care for their children, and maintain the small daily rituals that define civilization, even when civilization itself seems to be collapsing. The people of the 1300s faced something incomprehensible, something that should have broken them entirely, and they survived. Not unchanged, they were deeply, permanently scarred by what they'd experienced, but they survived. So as you drift towards sleep, carry this quiet understanding with you, that uncertainty is bearable, that loss can be survived, that the ordinary gestures of daily life, the sharing of bread, the lighting of candles, the speaking of kind words, these are not trivial things, but the very foundation of our humanity. The plague could kill bodies, but it couldn't kill the stubborn human insistence on meaning, on connection, on continuing. Let the 14th century release you now. Let those ghosts rest. You've kept vigil with them for these hours, witnessed their struggles, honoured their resilience. Now it's time to return to your own century, your own comfortable bed, your own peaceful sleep, carrying perhaps a little more gratitude for the ordinary miracle of waking up healthy, in a world where plague is a historical memory rather than an everyday terror. Sleep well, traveller. The past is past, tomorrow's another day,